professional background, I planned something a little bit more formal than this. I am, however, relieved that we're sitting in a sort of slightly closed, sweaty little room, and we can have more of a conversation about some of the themes that I'm going to address. Now, I was asked to talk a little bit about Seri and a little bit about the law. And what I'm going to start off by doing is talking a little bit about neither of those, but talking about something that I've rather pretentiously named the contemporary moment, with which I would suggest future leaders, such as yourselves, and Seri as an organisation, and the law have to address. So if we're going to talk about the use of the law, the use of Seri, how useful I am, in whatever limited sense we may conclude, and what it is you are going to be leading in the future, we need to address, in my view, where South Africa is at the moment. What is this thing I could rather pretentiously call the contemporary moment? And I'm going to spend some time talking to you about where I think we are today as a society, to the extent to which such a thing exists. Then I'm going to suggest to you one or two ways I think the law and rights interact with what I identify as the most urgent problems of contemporary South African society. I'm going to offer a theory, and don't get too intimidated. It's not really that big a theory. It's not like gravitational waves or anything. Social science theory. I'm going to offer a theory of how law and rights interact with politics and interact with contemporary society and the contemporary moment. And then, and only then, having earned the right to do so, I hope, I'll tell you a little bit about Seri and how we feel we fit in with life, the universe, and everything, the contemporary moment and the way law and rights fit into it. So let's start off with the contemporary moment. Now, what I want to suggest to you is that where we are at the moment in South Africa can be summed up in one word. You will all be relieved that there is just one word and not many more. One word is interesting, many words can perhaps be boring. But I want to suggest to you that if we were to sum up South Africa today, the word I'd use is fracture. Now, what do I mean by fracture? Well, you've all heard about the Rainbow Nation, I hope. Lots of nice colours, all very separate. All joined in an image of what post-apartheid South African society is supposed to be. And that image is very consensual. Post-apartheid political action, we've been told over the last 20 years, is about seeking consensus. It's about working out how to live together, about working out how to reconcile. Reconcile is another watchword we all like to use without really knowing what it means. And for the last 20 years, we've been told apartheid's horrible, of course it was. Constitution, fantastic. Now let's all reconcile under some sort of rainbow flag, which where I came from meant something completely different from South African nationalism. And so if the immediate post-constitutional period was ever marked by a politics of consensus seeking, by a politics of reconciliation, and by an affirmed commitment to the Constitution, I want to suggest to you that that is not the case now. Politics and society are more conflictual and they're more fractured than ever before since the end of apartheid. So I'm not making any claims about before 1990. I'm trying to suggest to you that not that the post-apartheid dream is dead, far from it, but the dream of consensus the dream that we can all get along in this non-disputatious way, the dream that we can all agree on what the most appropriate social and economic course for South Africa is, I think that's dead. That was never realistic. In fact, the Constitution itself seeks to accommodate a great deal of discord, a great deal of disagreement. It seeks to accommodate lots of different people who have different ideas, different conceptions of the good, different religions, no religion at all, different economic ideas, different political ideas. And it seeks to accommodate people who might believe, for example, homosexuality is a sin, and people like me who believe neither that homosexuality is a sin, because I'm gay myself, and don't believe in God in the same country. So the idea of the Constitution is to accommodate dispute, is to accommodate dissent. And we've had a political myth over the last 20 years ago which suggests that the Constitution doesn't really have to do that because we're all living in this rainbow nation where we're all reconciled. And we finally woke up to the fact that that's a nonsense. That we are a deeply fractured society. We're a deeply unequal society. We're a society that has profoundly different ideas about what life is, what the good is, what the purpose of our existence is on this little rock we call Earth. And what I want to suggest to you is that there are really 5 or 6 fracture lines in contemporary South African politics. Before I do, I want to do a little advertising for my husband, who's just written a book called South Africa's Insurgent Citizens, that takes forward this idea of fracture and disruption. We're dreadful at this. We tend to go around branches of exclusives and count how many have been sold. We are that sad. When you get to my age, alcohol and drugs don't really do it anymore, and you have to find some other pastime. So I tend to count my husband's books. So there are 6 left in Rosebery. They're very reasonably priced. And if you're interested in this idea of fracture and disruption, and how it links to forms of different political action today, and I would suggest as future leaders, if that is a title to which you aspire, you ought to at least acquaint yourself with that sort of thing. I would suggest you go and either take the book out of a library if you can find one, or buy it at a very reasonable 200 rand. South Africa's Insurgent Citizens by Julian Brown. I can now go home and tell him that I've sold his book. So, South Africa's Insurgent Citizens, Julian Brown. Further details, I'm sure, can be Googled. So what are the contours of the present-day South African fracture? Well, I would suggest the most important fracture is economic. We have high levels of poverty and inequality, everybody knows that. But what isn't often acknowledged sufficiently is that since the end of apartheid, poverty's changed not at all, or virtually not at all. Poverty has been reduced very, very slightly. The only major social success this government can claim is the expansion of social grants. And people who are very, very poor, literally who need 200 to 300 rand a month to survive, have been able to access social grants, and social grants policy has expanded. The child support grant in particular has expanded to older and older children. The pensions have more or less kept pace with inflation. And for that reason, if you looked at a graph that dealt with poverty since the end of apartheid, you'd find it tiny tick down. Small, significant perhaps, but from the base of poverty that people lived in at the end of apartheid, I'm sure we'd all agree not enough. The news on inequality is much worse. Inequality has got worse since the end of apartheid. South Africa was vying with Brazil for the title of most unequal country in the world in 1994, 1995. And Brazil has adopted an economic policy that resulted in the redistribution of not the wholesale, not a particularly ambitious redistribution of wealth, but a significant redistribution of wealth. It expanded its welfare state. It invested a massive amount into education. It secured people's land rights. And Brazil slowly falling down the list of very unequal countries. South Africa, unfortunately, is going in the opposite direction. We've done nothing to address inequality since the end of apartheid. And our economic policy, which tends to be based on the idea that one reduces barriers to foreign direct investment as low as possible and increases inflation in order to, increases interest rates in order to keep inflation low, actively destroys job opportunities and opportunities for job creation. So you'll see politicians stand up all the time, it doesn't matter what party they are. The DA on economic policy is probably worse than the ANC, but not much. You'll see politicians stand up and say we need to create jobs, but none of them criticizing the economic framework that we've adopted, which is designed not to create jobs. It's designed to make sure that the cost of money doesn't diminish over time. The value of money, doesn't diminish over time. It's the economic orthodoxy inherited from Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. Ronald Reagan was the first American politician to go on television with an economics graph. And it was something called the Laffer curve. Now, I'm not going to go into what the Laffer curve is, largely because I would probably mess it up if I tried to explain it. But it explains the theory that, in the long run, economic policy should be directed towards keeping inflation down rather than keeping employment up. So it's a theory that in the long term, what we ought to be doing is making sure that money retains its value over time. And if the cost of that is relatively high levels of structural unemployment, then that's a price worth paying. And there was a big debate in the UK in the 1980s where Margaret Thatcher very famously said, unemployment is a price worth paying for low inflation. Now, you listen to economic reports on radios or on TV today, and you'll hear two things. You'll hear some random guy from some investment bank somewhere complaining that Standard & Poor might be just about to downgrade South Africa again, as if that ever mattered to anyone. As if that matters to people who are selling bunny chow on the streets. Do they give a toss about whether or not Standard & Poor thinks that South Africa is a good credit investment? I suspect not. And the second thing you'll hear is this obsession with unemployment. You won't hear an obsession with unemployment. You'll hear an obsession with inflation. And the idea that in order to keep inflation down, we've got to keep interest rates relatively high. And recently, interest rates went up, precisely because, first of all, we were worried about the value of the rand, and secondly, we were worried about inflation possibly going up. Now, there's some truth in the theory that if inflation goes up a lot, if inflation is running at 50 to 100%, like weird, out there, fairy tale type rates, then there is an impact on the poor, obviously, because the money the poor manage to get hold of today is worth less tomorrow, profoundly less tomorrow than it is today. And so basic foodstuffs become very expensive. But the economics, and if you've probably all heard of Thomas Piketty, an economic theorist of inequality, the economics suggests something a little bit different. The economics suggests that you can keep inflation in the region of below 20%, which is much higher than our current inflation target. And really the impact on the poor is very low. The impact on people who have lots of money, of course, and I'm talking hundreds of millions and billions of rand, is very high. Because over time, the value of their money holdings goes down. Interest rates are likely to be low because inflation is high, and the return on the investments of their money is very low because interest rates are low, and the value of their money is going down over time. And so for rich people, high inflation is a very bad thing. It's a much worse thing for rich people than it is for poor people. Now, how do you keep inflation low? We've agreed that, or I've told you, that rich people need low inflation, poor people, not so much. How do we keep inflation low? Well, we keep inflation low with higher interest rates. Because most people in this country, when they spend money they don't have. So if any of you own your own houses or live in a house that your parents own or that a member of your family owns, chances are there's a big bond on that property. The property has been purchased with the use of a loan, and that loan is subject to interest rates. Now, if one increases, interest rates are essentially the cost of borrowing. If one increases interest rates, you have to pay more to pay a loan back over time. If you increase interest rates, people are inclined to spend less because most of the time they're not spending money they've earned, or a lot of the time they're not spending money they've earned. They're spending money they've borrowed from the bank. Most people in this country, the consumer society that we all think we live in, consumers are spending money that they don't have. They're spending money that the bank gives them. I've certainly got a credit card debt. Many of you may well have a credit card debt. You have a bond, you have a loan over your house. All of that is spending. It keeps the economy growing. And if you raise interest rates, it becomes harder to borrow money and spend and keep the economy growing. Now, the higher interest rates in South Africa are very, very high. And in England, interest rates are 0.5%, I think now, 1%. In South Africa, the commercial interest rate that you would pay on a bank loan for a car or a house is about 10 or 11%. Very, very high interest rates, there to preserve the value of money. It's also stopping people from spending and investing in machinery and plant and all the things that keep the economy going. It's stopping people from borrowing money to take risks in setting up businesses. It's stopping people from generating economic activity. What it is doing is making returns on financial investments quite high, because if you put money in a bank account, there's high interest, the money makes money over time because of the high interest rates. But high interest rates also stop people from purchasing things. Purchasing buildings if you need to start up a business. Purchasing machines if you need to make something with a machine in that business. Purchasing a car if you want to drive around and sell things out of your car. High interest rates, the high cost of credit hurts entrepreneurship. And we have high interest rates. And they are hurting entrepreneurship. They are hurting small businesses. They are hurting people. They are discouraging people from setting up businesses and generating wealth and generating economic activity. And the theory that is demonstrated by the Laffer curve says that has a knock-on effect on employment. Now, it should stand to reason that it does, because the more businesses you have, the more industry you have, the more employment you have. If people are discouraged from setting up businesses and setting up new enterprises, they're discouraged from employing people. So, low inflation, high interest rates, low growth in employment. That's the economic policy we have at the moment, from a very high base of structural unemployment as well. Expanded unemployment rate, which includes you often hear that unemployment is about 25, 26%. It's not, it's 40%. 25% is people who are out of work but looking for it. The expanded unemployment rate, which is 40%, includes people who are just so hatful with the whole enterprise of looking for jobs that aren't there that they've given up. And so the true unemployment rate in this country is 40%. And it is 40% in part because of economic choices this government has made, and economic choices that would be no different if, God forbid, we elected the DA tomorrow, which I am not on any stretch of the imagination advocating. They might be a little bit different if we elected the EFF tomorrow. Don't laugh. Shame. But we don't know. I don't know what the EFF stands for. I don't know if any of you do. They seem to stand for disruption and protest, and which I don't think is such a bad thing. If you read the book that we started with, that I adverted to at the beginning of this talk, maybe we need a bit of disruption. Maybe we need a bit of protest. But I'm not sure at all what the EFF's economic policy is, and I'm not sure that they really know. So all I'm trying to say is that economic choices that have been made by this government and any other government we're likely to elect are designed to keep inflation down and keep employment down and pacify the interests of big business that have lots of money to invest and want a return on their financial investments. And that creates a fracture in our society between rich and poor, and high levels of poverty and all the social ills that come with it. One more thing I want to say about the economy. The other economic choice that's been made in this country since the end of apartheid has been to roll back trade barriers and tariffs. So if you are a country, let's call you Bohemia, and you want to make shoes, and your whole thing is making shoes. You make the best shoes in the world, and you export the shoes to everywhere else in the world. Economic history dictates that you probably became the best shoemaker in the world because the government decided that it was going to grow the shoe industry. And how was it going to grow the shoe industry? It was going to massively increase the costs of importing shoes from outside Bohemia. And in order to do that, it imposed massive tariffs on imports of shoes into Bohemia. We used to do it with textiles. There was a massive textile industry in KwaZulu-Natal. And in the late 90s, because of our international treaty obligations, or what we thought they were, we reduced tariffs. In fact, we obliterated tariffs that were protecting the textile industry. And thousands of jobs in KwaZulu-Natal were lost. Now, at the end of the Second World War, many Eastern economies, China, not so much, actually China's a special case, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, were in ruins. And the way that they became the massive economic giants they are now, based in cars and technology, really. Most of whether you think you have an Apple in your pocket or not, whether you think Apple is an American country or not, an American company or not, the fact of the matter is the Apple in your pocket was made somewhere in the Far East. The Samsung in your pocket was definitely made in Korea because Samsung is a Korean company. So what they did in order to become the car and electronic giants they are now was exactly what I've just described. They threw up massive tariffs around the electronic industries. They made importing electronics made elsewhere very, very expensive. Many of those electronics were made in Europe and America, and a lot of people lost jobs in Europe and America because of that. And there was a transfer of jobs and a transfer of resources from Europe and America to the Far East because of those tariffs. But it was necessary to put those tariffs up to allow businesses to grow and learn from their mistakes. I can tell you now, the first Samsung mobile phone that came off the factory conveyor belt in Korea was probably a shocking piece of work. it was probably a desperately horrible mobile phone that no one in their right mind would want to use. But the millionth mobile phone was better. The 2 millionth mobile phone was better. The 3 millionth mobile phone was better than that. And the point of tariffs is to allow businesses to learn how to make good stuff. And no country anywhere in the world has managed to industrialize or achieve anything close to full employment without protecting native industries. Now, that's not to suggest absolutely every industry has to be protected and tariffs have to go up everywhere and in relation to every good. But you'll sometimes hear, not as often as you should, that South Africa needs an industrial policy. And all an industrial policy is you choose a few industries that you want to grow, and you subsidize them heavily, and you protect them against international competition. That is a policy choice this country has never made since the end of apartheid. Lots of protectionism in the 20th century, lots of preference for employment over inflation, low inflation in the 20th century, but that only obviously benefited white people. Black people weren't, African people weren't allowed to own businesses, and Indian and coloured people were under similar sorts of legally imposed disadvantages. So all the really good economic policy that grew the economy and industrialised South Africa to the extent that it is industrialised was accepted uncontroversially in South Africa in the 20th century, but it only benefited white people. Now, at the end of apartheid, we've swung with the economic policy pendulum over to a much more conservative economic policy at just the point we need to spread an expansionist economic policy and the benefits of it to everybody else. So the first fracture is that economic choices have been made that benefit large businesses, do not benefit small businesses, that do not tackle inequality, that prefer low inflation over high employment, and buy into an international consensus of free trade and low tariffs and the gradual elimination of tariffs. In circumstances where it's very comfortable for Britain or America or Japan to preach free trade because they've grown their industries without having to bear the brunt of free trade. And a lot of the diplomatic problems you see between America and China, part of it is because China owns most of America's debt. A bit tricky. But also part of it is that China, when it feels like it, just ignores tariffs. Ignores international tariff policy. It just puts tariffs up whenever it feels like it. It protects its industries and it doesn't give a toss what America does. India is a little bit the same. Since Modi became Prime Minister, the economic policy has become a little bit more conservative. But India has virtually no respect for patents. So it makes much cheaper, creates jobs by making cheaper versions of stuff that is patented out elsewhere. What's wrong with that? And has a very liberal attitude towards tariffs. South Africa, more than any other country, buys in to international economic orthodoxy. And what I want to suggest to you is that has created a profoundly delicate social situation with high unemployment and high inequality in this country. So that was economic fracture. What about social fracture? The frequency of community-based protest. In 2012, the year of the Marikana massacre, police statistics suggest that there were over 12,000 protests in South Africa. 12,000 community-based protests. Almost all of them were localized and more or less spontaneous. And because of that, because we're experiencing this high frequency of social fracture, people basically getting fed up and going out to protest because they're ignored by ward councillors. They vote for a party that promises them the earth and delivers, well, should we say rather less than that, and are fed up with not having a secure place to stay, not having a secure place to live, not having access to water, not having access to electricity. And they're fed up with the multiple promises that are made more or less every 5 years around election time when people want the votes, are more or less fed up with the promises that are made for goods that they never get, and are also fed up with the unconsultative and often corrupt way in which local government runs itself. A lot of these protests are spontaneous, community-based expressions of frustration. And so very often a community-based protest will start with somebody blocking a road. I can't go to work because I don't have a job. Why the hell should I let you go to work? It's a political impulse. Think of it what you will. You might think that's a very selfish thing. I'm sure I do. But that's the impulse. So you get burning tyres across the road and a traffic jam, and some poor bugger on 702 going, we don't know why these people are protesting, because they've gone nowhere near them because they're too scared. And community-based protest ends up being reported as some sort of traffic problem to avoid. Now, what I want to point out here as a point of social fracture is not only that there are so many community-based protests, but also that the middle class tends to ignore them as much as it possibly can. And dealing with them as traffic problems to be avoided on 702 or Jacaranda or 94.7 or any of those sort of predominantly white presented and white listened to radio stations. I hardly ever hear traffic warnings about protests on Radio 2000. There tends to be, I think there's a bit of a racial dynamic, but should you think in South Africa? But there's a class dynamic as well, and the class response is best summed up by how Patrick Bond referred to the protests, community-based protests, in a book he wrote some time ago. He called them popcorn protests. The idea that these protests just expand and pop and then they're over. They don't mean anything. Like when you sort of put popcorn in a microwave, it sort of explodes. So I have very little experience with popcorn, so I may have got that wrong. But this tendency to write it off as inconsequential, as meaningless, as unorganized, as unfocused, as the result of people who don't know what's good for them, is incredibly disempowering, and it's a class response to people who protest, quite frankly, because they've never heard of the Laffer curve and they don't really care about it. They haven't heard my rather long and abstruse lecture about tariffs and inflation and unemployment, and why should it mean much to them even if they had? What they know is that they don't have jobs today. They don't have electricity today. They don't have a safe place to live today. They don't have access to water today. They don't have access to adequate healthcare or education today. And community-based protests are a natural response to this, and a natural response of the state and the bureaucracy's more or less ignorance that this is an urgent crisis situation. And another point of fracture is the way the middle class and the state, to some extent, writes off popcorn protest as popcorn protest, as unorganised and as unfocused and without a politics. Should we really be writing off the choices people make to draw attention to their grievances? I think we should be doing a lot more listening rather than telling people to drive a different way to work. Civil society, the bit of South Africa that I'm engaged with, is also fractured. And perhaps the best illustration of this was a debate you might have seen in the pages of the Daily Maverick last year. And it was a debate between the man who directs the organisation you've just heard from, Mark Hayward, and Irvin Jim, who is the General Secretary of NUMSA and heavily involved with the United Front. Now, Mr. Hayward was one of the architects of the hashtag Zuma Must Fall marches, which took place in December 2015. And you'll remember there was a small gathering there was a large gathering in Cape Town, a small gathering on Mandela Bridge, and literally maybe a dozen or so people in Durban who, in the aftermath of President Zuma's little tap dance with the Treasury, changing the finance minister twice in a week, protested, saw this as an incidence of the president's so-called corruption, and united under a banner of Zuma Must Fall, which was, of course, stolen straight from the students' movement with fees must fall and roads must fall. And so now it was hashtag Zuma Must Fall. And this was fairly heavily criticised. The Irvin Jim and many other people criticised those marches as elite, white-dominated, as expressions of outrage against an insufficiently defined idea of corruption. So if you listen to the criticism, these guys were gathering on Mandela Bridge and wherever else and saying, down with corruption, without really knowing what it means. Does it mean, and there's a real issue about, all of this anti-corruption politics. Now, hands up everybody who thinks corruption is good. Right. Nobody thinks corruption is good. But nobody really knows what it is either, right? So, is corruption merely, for example, claiming a per diem? If you're a government official, you know what a per diem is, an allowance you get from the government if you have to go out of the office for a day. Is it claiming a per diem when you shouldn't claim it, as the president of Tanzania recently said that it was? Define corruption as too many officials claiming per diems when they shouldn't really claim per diems. Is it spending more money than you should upgrading your rural residents, I don't know, in somewhere like in Handler? Is it having 2 ministerial cars where one will do? Is it giving a job to your friend instead of somebody who is objectively well qualified for it, assuming your friend isn't objectively well qualified for it? Or is it something broader than that? Is it a series of political choices that are made that do not favour the majority, that don't take into account the majority's interests, like the economic choices that I started off this talk with? The fracture in civil society is about that debate. And the reason why I talk to the debate between Mark Hayward and Irvin Jim is that Mark Hayward said, look, I know that there are these problems with defining corruption. He didn't actually say he knew there were problems with defining corruption. Let's just assume that he said that. He said, look, whatever your problems, what we need to do is ensure that the anger around the dismissal of Nhlanhla Nene is harnessed and directed. Yes, the marchers were disproportionately white, but the problem was not the presence of white people, and he said there were a lot of black middle-class people there as well. He said the problem with the marchers is that poor black people weren't there, didn't come to the marches. And he blamed this on Irvin Jim. He said, you're a union leader, you should be getting your members out to come to my march. You can imagine how Irvin Jim responded to that. But he went further. He said, the reason why there are no poor black people coming to our marches is because of the shackles put on poor black people by working class religious organisations, poverty, and the union movement. And then he said, the United Front and NUMSA failed to endorse the march, and that's a problem. Now think about that. The reason why people don't come and attend my march is because their union leaders tell them not to. They live in poverty, so they kind of don't know better. And what was the other thing? Religion. They believe in God, so they don't know better. I'd suggest to you that that is an unrealistically patronizing idea of what poor people in this country are capable of thinking and doing. And that whether poor people believe in God or not, whether they're a member of, whether anybody believes in God or not, or whether they're a member of a union or not, they're capable of thinking, and whether they live in poverty or not, they're capable of thinking and acting for themselves. And if they don't turn up for a march, that is to some extent the product of a choice they have made. And of course, Irvin Jim comes back and he says that that's exactly it, that people haven't turned up to this march because it was meaningless. He said it needed to be attached to a critique of what he saw as anti-poor economic policy in the Treasury that had been pursued for 20 years. He said that Hayward's explanations for the absence of poor black people were patronising, as I've just suggested to you that they were. Now, the debate became deeply personalised. It's Irvin Jim yapping at Mark Hayward and Mark Hayward yapping back at Irvin Jim. And I'd like to suggest to you that personalised debates have fairly severe limitations. You've got to make it about the issue, not about the person. You're going to be criticising people's ideas and their beliefs, not their personal attributes. But if you take the personal heat out of that debate, the differences were one of principle. Is it appropriate for a civil society movement to limit its demands to the removal of a sitting president for corruption, whatever that may mean, without providing a definitive account of what corruption is, that's sensitive to social and economic inequality? And had the Zuma Must Fall marchers done this, would they have succeeded in attracting more poor black people? I don't know. But what I'm suggesting to you is that there's a fracture in civil society at the moment between, probably one of many fractures in civil society, this is just what I'm choosing to talk about, between a growing anti-corruption movement, a self-styled anti-corruption movement, that seems to suggest that transparent tendering processes, good governance, the absence of nepotism in government is enough, and fails to expand its critique to the economic choices that I started this talk with. And that there are those of us in civil society who believe that the anti-corruption critique is vague and stunted, and quite often very patronising to people who live in poverty, because poor people tend to be used. If you dig down in the critique mounted by the anti-corruption lobby, very often they're saying, well, we're not really talking about the corruption we are victims of. The corruption is really bad for the poor. That may well be, but I suspect you should probably let the poor tell you that. You should let them make corruption an issue. And there's a fracture in civil society between civil society organisations that seek to preserve the spaces in which the poor and the dispossessed and people at the wrong end of the redistribution of wealth seek to define their own agendas for change. Those of us that seek to support the poor when they implement their own agendas for change, and a sort of what I would suggest is a much more conservative, much more limited anti-corruption discourse in civil society. And let me give you just one example. And this comes a little bit into talking to you about what SERI's about. SERI would never campaign for the removal of a sitting president, because that's not a problem for us. The problem for us is whoever is the president, there are these economic choices that have been made that sustain inequality. There are problems with the distribution of resources. There are people's socioeconomic rights not being realized. And it doesn't matter whether Cyril Ramaphosa or Jacob Zuma or Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma or Musi Maimane or Julius Malema as the president. Those problems on day one of their presidency, those problems are going to be there. And it doesn't really matter who they are, who's sitting in union buildings. And so it's irrelevant to us to call for the removal of this or that president. Maybe Jacob Zuma should go. Who knows? I don't know. I'm agnostic on that question. But I sure as hell know that my client's problems won't be solved overnight if he does go. My client's problems are still going to be there. And so this fracture in civil society deals with the different approaches civil society organizations have to social change. And there is that fracture there. Civil society organizations that have an economic critique, that have a critique of inequality, and not only that, but seek not to displace the agency of poor communities, not to speak for poor communities, but to enable poor communities to speak for themselves, on the one hand, and on the other hand, a portion of civil society that either represents privileged group interests like the Free Market Foundation or AfriForum. No prize for guessing what their particular attitude is. AfriForum is let's preserve all of the cultural advantages white people experienced under apartheid without saying that's what we're doing, but that's what we're doing. And the Free Market Foundation is there for the free. So to single issue NGOs and other NGOs whose critique of what's wrong at the moment and what needs to change is superficial. And NGOs that seek to speak on behalf of the poor hate corruption, without any evidence of actually having poor people that say they hate corruption and it's a big political issue for them, and that define what corruption is more importantly. And so that jump on this sort of bandwagon of let's get rid of the president, he's corrupt, and once we get rid of him, all corruption will end and we'll be fine. So those are the differences of approaches in civil society, and they map on, what I want to suggest to you is that they map on to the other debates that I've sketched out in front of you. I have this hideous sense that I'm going way over my time. I think I have about 10 to 20 minutes left because we started a little bit late. I'm going to try and maybe give you 3 more ideas. The final fracture I want to suggest to you is as a scheme of as a feature of the contemporary moment is identity fracture. The emergence of things like neo-traditionalism. Everybody understand what I mean by neo-traditionalism? The repurposing of ideas of tradition, not just African tradition, not just sort of Zulu ethnicity, but Muslim tradition, white religious traditions. The repurposing of those traditions in order to create a conservative vision of social interaction, and one that seeks to preserve differences between people instead of trying to show to people what they have in common. So the emergence of neo-traditionalism, identity politics. I am an Afrikaner. I'm not an Afrikaner. I'm suggesting that the statement "I am an Afrikaner" asserts a political identity that excludes just as much as it includes. If somebody says "I am an Afrikaner," they're making an implicit statement about their difference to all those people who aren't Afrikaners. Now, there's nothing wrong with identifying yourself with a particular ethnicity or a particular language or a particular race, but how you do it and how you practice your politics afterwards can be right or wrong. It can be destructive or empowering. And you see this mostly in the new politics of race and ethnicity. So I work as a lawyer for an organisation called Abahlali Basiam Jundolo, which is an organisation of shack dwellers in KwaZulu-Natal. It has both Zulu members and members of Amapondo ethnicity who've migrated up from the Eastern Cape into Durban. And what it often finds is that when it comes to deciding who's going to get housing opportunities in Durban, who's going to get evicted and who's not going to get evicted from informal settlements, the local state always goes for the Amapondos first. So there's growing evidence, and that's just one example, of the state, particularly in KwaZulu-Natal, allocating resources along ethnic lines. Saying if you're a Zulu, you get a house, if you're Amapondo, you don't. Now, what does that remind you of? What was it in South Africa, not so long ago, where we said, if you're white, then you get something. It sounds like a Startite, but I can't. It's a return to what apartheid was. It's mobilizing political identity and resources around ideas of colour and ethnicity. And it's something that we should be worried about. Operation Fiela. Anybody heard of Operation Fiela? Again, completely about targeting. I mean, it was the most ridiculous response that we all seem to have accepted quite passively. The renewed xenophobic violence last year, the government's response to it was Operation Fiela, which was addressed towards evicting illegal immigrants from inner city buildings and sending them back to their home countries, usually via some god-awful internment camp like Lindela. Again, a way of responding to xenophobia by reinforcing it, by saying we are going to solve the xenophobia problem by solving the immigrant problem. How do we solve the immigrant problem? We kick all the immigrants out. Again, a very concerning development. And very often, xenophobia itself is created by the state. It's created by what the government does. The government has a choice. Government officials have a choice. They can say, you know what, the reason why you don't have water is because you're one of 1,000 communities that we're trying to give water to. And you know what, the government's corrupt and it's inefficient and we're trying the hardest we possibly can, but you just don't have water yet, and I'm sorry. Do government officials ever say that? No. Very often what they say is you don't have water because you don't have any money. You don't have any money because that Somali guy is running the store that you should be running. You don't have, or we can't give you water because there are all these foreigners coming in here and they are illegally gaining access to our resources and they're getting the water that belongs to you. That's the way, and I've seen it, that's the way the state often responds to xenophobia. It nourishes it. It gives it an excuse. It uses it as a convenient way of excusing its own inability to provide the goods that are necessary for a decent existence. So xenophobia isn't just something that emerges out of nowhere. It emerges out of particular social practices. And those social practices are often the practices of the state. I tell you now, if the state turned around and everybody who was involved in the state decided, we're not only going to go on television and say xenophobia is a bad thing, but in our community meetings we're going to refuse to suggest that our failings are in any way due to immigration to South Africa. We're going to be honest about why we're not able to do everything that we promised to do or we want to do, and we're not going to blame the foreigners. Xenophobia will be much less of a problem. Xenophobia is created by the state. and created by certain forms of political action. It's not a natural condition of human beings. We naturally empathize with each other. We don't naturally decide that people from outside South Africa's borders are somehow less deserving and require harsh treatment. There's also a resurgent politics of race. And you've seen this most clearly from the Rhodes Must Fall and Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall movement. That there is a re-emergent politics of black consciousness, I would suggest, at the core of those movements, and a way of discussing inequality which is about race as well as class. There's quite an exciting discourse of trying to understand the ways in which students are discriminated against because of their race, or discriminated against because of their class, discriminated against because of both. And that kind of progressive politics of race, that reflective politics of race, that makes people like me reflect on the nature of the advantages we've been given, that forces people like me to accept the nature of those inequalities, and empowers black people and poor people to critique the systems that maintain disadvantage is extremely empowering. That kind of politics of race is something that is actually should make us quite optimistic. And the Rhodes Must Fall and the Fees Must Fall movements are a source for optimism. But on the other hand, the politics of race can be used to exclude and dominate. Shireen Hassim, who's a professor of politics at Wits University, recently commented that the resurgence of populist Africanism, which for most part privileges racial identity over other forms of identity, has served to repress gender politics, for example, and has served to repress gay and lesbian politics. So once you assert race is everything, or class is everything, or sexual orientation is everything, you immediately exclude all other forms of human experience. And so identity politics, on the one hand, can be very empowering. You can say that this is a racial problem, or this is a class problem, or this is a gender problem, and expose something really important about society, and expose the nature of the inequalities people experience. And that can be very empowering. It can be empowering to the people on the wrong end of those inequalities, and it can empower people on the right end of those inequalities to think more reflectively about the culture of discrimination and inequality from which they benefit. So there's a positive, what I'm trying to suggest to you is a positive politics of race, and there's a negative politics of race. But more broadly, there's a positive politics of identity, and there's a negative politics of identity. And since the end of apartheid, there's been a white politics of race going on all the time. We just dress it up as the politics of the market, and the politics of private property, and the politics of economics. Property debates in this country, debates about the distribution of property, are highly racialized. All of the people standing up for private property rights and saying that one shouldn't be redistributing property Zimbabwe style, as if that was ever an option here, it can't have escaped your attention. Those are all white people. And the people who are pressing for more redistribution of land, more radical redistribution of land, are black people, by and large. And the politics of white racial identity is very often asserted, if you're not Afrikaans, through an assertion of the sanctity of the market and the sanctity of property rights. If you're an Afrikaner, you're usually claiming your right to cultural preservation. So there are the reason why I say all of this is that I don't want you to walk away thinking that I've got a thing about the politics of Africanism. I don't. I have a thing about the politics of identity. And there are different ways that identity politics get played out in positive, negative ways all the time. But just recently, to round off, the resurgent politics of identity in South Africa is another source of fracture. Partly because people are so fed up with the Rainbow Nation reconciliation nonsense that it obscures inequality and oppression much more than it provides a way of discussing the nature of inequality and oppression. But whatever you replace the politics of reconciliation with the politics of Rainbow Nation with has to be capable of accommodating empathy between people of different races, different genders, different sexual orientations, different religious beliefs, and no religious beliefs, because that's what the Constitution is there to do. And to round off, and I completely departed from the structure I started off with, but I realised that I'm probably terribly out of time. To round off, that's really what the Constitution is about. It's about creating spaces in which people can lead respectful, dignified lives. Rights, in my view, are about protecting agency. What does it mean to be a human? What does it mean to be a person? It means lots of different things to lots of different people. But at the core, I would suggest it's about agency. It's about being able to will your purpose, have a purpose in life, and pursue it. And the magic of rights, if there is any magic at all, and sometimes I wonder as a lawyer, the magic of rights is that they preserve the spaces in which agency can be exercised. And when you make a rights claim, I have a right to education, I have a right to free speech, I have a right to healthcare, you're saying, I have a right to the space in which I can exercise my human agency. I have a right to speak. I have a right to be educated, to access literature, to access scientific knowledge. I have a right to not be sick. Has anybody ever tried to exercise their agency while sick? It doesn't go very well. You get about 5 meters outside your bedroom and then you fall over. So rights, it seems to me, are about preserving the spaces in which we become fully human by exercising our agency and by realizing ourselves. That has a couple of consequences, and the one I want to leave you with is that rights can never be defined from above. They can never be what lawyers tell you they are. They can never be what judges tell you they are. They can never be what politicians tell you they are. The spaces in which rights are exercised are created by individual people themselves in their everyday practices and in the assertions that they make about what rights they have and in the stories that they tell about their lives. And what SERI tries to do in the services that it provides, both as lawyers, as advocates, people who go on Twitter and TV and speak up for social causes, and as researchers, is expand the spaces that are available to our clients to define for themselves what social change means and what social justice is. I'll leave it there.